full analysis of the bacterium flagellum, the immune system, the blood clotting cascade, and other examples from Michael Behe's book and other ID literature, Miller showed how the scientific foundation of ID was factually wrong. This is in court with a jury, expert witnesses, a judge, and everything. This is where it really counts. This is where reality occurs. You don't get to go to the court of public opinion with people who don't know what they're talking about. When the evolutionists spoke in court, they demonstrated with the evidence that ID is not a science. And the judge ruled in the courts in the favor of the scientists. Because ID proponents claim that evolution fails to explain certain phenomena, Miller also illustrated the superiority of evolution over ID in explaining the functioning of living things. The final expert witness, paleontologist Kevin Padian, made the same points as he dissected the claims about fossils in the scientific creationist book of Pandas and People. They don't have their fossil information correct. The ID people. Showing factual and conceptual errors, and of Pandas and People fails to live up to true and accurate and realistic and rational scientific procedures and standards. Part of the message of the scientists was that real evolutionary biology and paleontology, not this distorted version in the ID literature of Pandas and People, it was not only valid science, but it is fascinating science. And the judge really appreciated this. One reporter reported, for 6 weeks, the courtroom of Judge John E. Jones III was like the biology class you wish you had taken. Theologian John Hout provided a dignified discourse on the history of the ideas of design, and he clearly placed ID in the company of William Paley. But perhaps the most devastating witness was Barbara Forrest, who showed this evidence that I just showed you on the board. That was Barbara Forrest. Now, what is interesting, on page 100, Forrest presented data showing that ID and creation science use parallel faulty arguments to discredit evolution, such as gaps in the fossil record, the Cambrian explosion, the rejection of naturalism, so on and so on. The defense witnesses tried valiantly to argue that ID was a legitimate scientific and scholarly enterprise rather than a shell hiding behind a religious agenda, and they failed. But they did not convince the judge. With the withdrawal of the ID powerhouses William Dembski and Stephen Meyer, Behe and Minich were almost left alone to carry the burden for the science and philosophy of science sides. Sociologist Steve Fuller did not help the cause. Get this, the ID scholar and sociologist, Steve Fuller, on the witness stand, sworn under oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing, so help him God, and he put his hand on that Bible. Here's what he confessed on the witness stand in the Dover trial for the ID movement. This is the court. He admitted that ID was a modern form of creationism. He blew off their head with that one. He also agreed that ID's reliance on supernatural causation was outside science as currently practiced. He just blew a hole in the heart of ID. He admitted what they were trying to hide. Yeah. After 21 days of testimony over 6 weeks, Judge Jones ruled in a carefully reasoned, written 139-page opinion that the Dover ID policy was unconstitutional. The purpose of the policy was to promote religion. That's what Dover proved about ID. He wrote, and its effect would be to privilege one sectarian religious view over others. That is why I am against the intelligent design movement and their politics and their cheating policies. They are no good to follow. They will destroy our religious freedoms. And I want to keep mine. He also spent considerable time discussing the scientific failings of ID. This is probably the first and only legal decision you will read that almost nonchalantly tosses off the term exaptation. The judge explained, "Finally, we will offer our conclusion." Now, this is the judge. This is not some biased scientist, atheist, godless evolutionist. This is a conservative Christian judge in court after 6 weeks of seeing the evidence on both sides of the argument. Is it evolution or is it intelligent design? This is the judge's conclusion. This is not a biased scientist speaking, trying to hide the truth. First, we will offer our conclusion on whether ID is science, not just because it is essential to our holding that an Establishment Clause violation has occurred in this case. In other words, it's against the First Amendment, the separation of church and state. But also in the hope that it may prevent the obvious waste of judicial and other resources, which would be occasioned by a subsequent trial involving the precise question which is before us. In other words, the intelligent design movement trying to masquerade as science is a waste of the judge's time. We are talking backhand, you chumps. We find that ID fails on 3 different levels. Judge Jones identifies them, any one of which is sufficient to preclude a determination that ID is science. They are, number 1, ID violates the centuries-old ground rules of science by invoking and permitting supernatural causation. This is the judge speaking, not a biased atheistic scientist. This is the judge. The second argument is the argument of irreducible complexity central to intelligent design. This is what a court of law decided, employs the same flawed and illogical, contrived dualism that doomed creation science in the 1980s. And the third point was, ID's negative attacks on evolution have been refuted by the scientific community. It is additionally important to note that ID has failed to gain acceptance in the scientific community. It has not generated peer-reviewed publications, nor has it been the subject of testing and research. That's on page 101. Of Godfrey's book. That's the judge's opinion. Judge Jones, this is on page 114 of Giberson, Saving Darwin, a book I seriously recommend. You have to begin to educate yourselves. I promise. It's worth it. Giberson, good stuff. I'm going to become like Oprah Winfrey, aren't I? Every book I recommend, hopefully I'll make the authors a millionaire because millions of people will listen and go buy these and educate themselves properly. That'd be kind of nice, wouldn't it? All I ask is 10%. I'm doing my videos for free. I got to make some money somehow. I'm going to die to death of starvation. Judge Jones actually got angry, and he started asking questions. In his decision, he made reference to these flagrant and insulting falsehoods. Crap like this in their so-called scientific book of pandas and people. If you believe what that book says, throw it away. Not because we're suppressing free speech, but because it's bogus. You can do better.